Today we're going to try to make some sense of the Sony picture profile settings and adjustments. The black gamma pretty much adjusts the contrast in the dark areas. This will also, of course, affect the brightness. There are three settings. You have wide, normal, and narrow. With narrow pretty much affecting everything close to black, and wide affecting not only the black, but also stretching over into the gray area. This is going positive and negative for the middle. This is going positive and negative for the wide. This is going positive and negative for the narrow. The black level sets the black point. So basically, when you go positive, it actually lifts the blacks, makes them gray, and negative will make them darker. The knee adjustment basically sets at what point the compression in the highlights is going to start happening. So let's say that line is your dynamic range. What we can do is bring some of the area that's above the box, which is where the whites would be clipped, and bring that down a little so that we can add a little bit more of that dynamic range back into the scene. Now we can adjust the level up and down to determine at what point we want to make this adjustment, but we can also adjust the slope, where it's more of a gradual adjustment or it's a little more steep. In these next two clips, I set the point to 75. In the first, I set the slope to -5, and you can see how it's really compressing the whites in those clouds, but if I add a positive, now you actually have the whites back. Now the Cine gammas are similar to the knee adjustment, it's just a little more elegant about the way that it does it. Essentially what it's trying to do is take all of your dynamic range and then squeeze it into what your camera can record. Before we continue, just to try to understand it better, we have to determine the difference between gradation and contrast and what they are. Gradation is sort of like gradual. The lightest to the darkest parts, you can actually see the transition from one to the other. Now contrast is different. You have the black and the white, and there's a lot of contrast between the two. For example, looking at this chart and referencing Cine 1, you can see there's a nice smooth gradation from the 6 to the 9 in the darker parts of the chart, as opposed to Cine 4, which has more contrast overall. Now if you're curious what any of the Cine gammas look like, this chart will give you a good reference. And in case you're wondering, if you look on the right hand side there, it does go up to 110. Now I know on a lot of IRE charts it goes up to 100 and that's where the whites clip, but you can actually record more than your intended display might be able to show. Now in case you're wondering what that camcorder is at the top, I found this random gentleman talking about it online.
And the EX1, and I'm going to show you what they are. Straight off you'll see a difference in shape. What you have here is a wedge very reminiscent of the Canon XL. It's like the Canon XL has mated with an EX1 and created this, the EX3.
He seems pretty knowledgeable. I hope he's done well for himself. But moving on. Now as you can see here, two of the Cine gammas are referencing hypergammas, and it's giving you examples. And the way you make sense of that is the 460. That stands for the dynamic range when the 18% gray card is set at 33%. And for the Cine 2, it's 460% of the dynamic range when the 18% gray card is set at 30%. The two middle numbers should have 1 and a 0 before them. So the top one can go up to 109 on the IRE chart, and the bottom one is right at 100. Now this is just something I wanted to bring up. Not to say that you can't use S-Log2 in the 8-bit recording that the lower end cameras record in, but with 10-bit recording it really helps you with the gradation. You can see on this chart with the S-Log curve that on the left hand side where the darker parts of the image are, there's not too much there before it immediately starts curving up. And you can see where the Rec 709 gets to the white part all the way at the top quicker than it does with the Rec 709 800% and the S-Log. The Rec 709 800%, by the way, is so that you can check your S-Log2 footage. Now as I outlined here, for the Cine gammas, you sort of want to underexpose. You want to spot meter your subject, and then you want to maybe underexpose just a little bit, and then you can always bring everything back up. For S-Log, there's not much information in the dark areas, and it will be a little bit noisy, but what you can do is always bring that down in post. There's a lot more room for you to bring it down than for you to bring it up if you went too dark. For the standard gammas, you really want to get it right in camera. That's not to say you can't make adjustments in post, but it really helps if you nail your exposure. One of the color modes, of course, is saturation, where the colors are a lot more vibrant. Now when you adjust the color depth, if you make it a positive number, it'll be darker and more richer, like vibrant, potentially more saturated. When you make it negative, it will be lighter and less saturated. A practical use of this is something you may have seen in one of my other videos, where sometimes if you record in a certain picture style, especially in the blues, it is way too vibrant. So here you can see where there's no adjustment being made, and especially in the reflection there. Now -7, it's not that saturated. Now if we add 7, you can see even in the plug where it's very saturated. Color phase is basically rotating the hue. You can change all the colors at once by adjusting it +7 or -7 in either direction. That +32 and -32 is in reference to the saturation adjustment. For the color modes, they're pretty self-explanatory, and I've outlined them in the list here. That's not to say that you can't still mix and match these, but the color styles on the left were designed with the gamma on the right-hand side. The detail setting is pretty self-explanatory. The one thing I will mention is that I think detail does a better job than sharpening, even though it almost has the same effect. The other thing to mention is that crispening will tighten up your sharpness, or it will limit the effect on noise depending on which way you make the adjustment.